Well, I'm here with some friends. We are in the Botanic garden, which Alec, whom I'm about to introduce, tells us is the oldest, or one of the oldest. Second oldest, thank you. Such garden in Europe, and we're happy to be here. We are not at Little Sparta, but it will be mentioned. This is kind of we're going to try to feel the Little Sparta vibe. Browne is here. Hello, Leanne.
Hello.
And Laynie Browne.
Hello.
Yes relation, no relation.
Correct.
Is here. And Sophia DuRose, who's repping the public safety hat. It's chilly here in Edinburgh. Did I say we're in Edinburgh?
No. Yes.
And Alec Finlay, such an honor and pleasure to have you join us here. Thank you so much for doing that. We're going to talk about a massive work of 11 dressed blocks of stone. And what we're going to do is each of us is going to read what's carved on the stones, and then each of us, and only one of us here has actually seen it, but each of us is going to describe it briefly as a kind of round of descriptions of what it looks like, at least in the photographs we've seen, okay? Mm-hmm. So I'll start. The present order is the disorder of the future. And I see it sans juste. And I see it in a photograph from an angle down almost to ground level at a time of the day that must have been late afternoon, so that each block casts a shadow to its left and to its right and our left. Your turn.
The present order is the disorder of the future. Saint Just. And to me it looks like a giant typewriter. Keys.
Oh, I love that.
Wow.
Laynie
Okay,
Browne?
I'm going to misread the last two words because that's how I read it. Present order is the disorder of the future, Saint Just.
And do you want to try a description? Oh, that's hard to follow, Leanne.
I'm thinking about the many different ways we could read the stones in different orders.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. Sophia?
I also read it the way Laynie read it. The present order is the disorder of the future, Saint Just. And the stones they're like chunky, toppled over gravestones to me.
Okay. Alec, the maker, organizer of this work, is your father, Ian Hamilton Finlay. Do you want to read it and say something about it?
Well, I always think some of the best parts of your discussions are gentle corrections. So I always like to say to people that this is Stony Path, Little Sparta, because it's quite interesting. What is Little Sparta? People have got used to saying that, the garden at Little Sparta.
Right.
It's famous. Stony Path is the shepherd's cottage. So you were beginning to describe the scene. If you were there today, you'd be cold, and it would be more windy than here. You're looking beyond the stones at a hill called the Black Mount, a proper hill. Below us is a valley which belonged to my mother's parents. My grandfather was what they called the laird, the owner of that land, the landowner. She was like the black sheep that ran away with the poet. And my grandmother and grandfather gave my mother Stony Path because my mother and father had no money. So they ended up in this shepherd's cottage. Now, the shepherd's cottages in that part of the world are always the highest dwellings, and it's right on the edge of an expanse of quite wild heather moor with only hill sheep on it and grouse, wild birds. which stretches for 5 miles. It's right at the edge of cultivation. And the reason I always say Stony Path, Little Sparta, with a comma between them, is that the place exists in this wonderful dynamic tension between being an old farm, which gave the possibility of the garden to my father. He could only make that happen because of that gift of ending up in this place. And Little Sparta is a country, but it's a fantasy country. It's an invented country. So he would say it was in opposition to Edinburgh, the Athens of the North. It's playful, but it's also one of those quixotic gestures of the poet exile, who can't coexist with the world as it is, and therefore has to say that this is my realm. So Stony Path, Little Sparta have this. I'm a Stony Pathian. I was born at Stony Path, and then it didn't become Little Sparta until around the time these stones arrived. These are Portland stone, so they come from Dorset, kind of way, Somerset, that southwest of England, where a lot of the carving stone in Britain comes from. So it would be in that coast that's very associated with dinosaurs and fossils and minerals. So it's a carving stone. They're deeper than gravestones when you're there. They have a real, they're as high as what we're sitting on now. So they have a depth. They're monumental, they're epic. I remember this arriving. It's one of the largest pieces, and it could only happen when my father reached a certain point of fame, a commission. You know, it was paid for to be in an exhibition, I think in London at maybe the Hayward Gallery. So originally they were seen in an urban setting outdoors from one of the London bridges.
Really?
And my father, they would have been carved in Dorset by Nicholas Sloan, one of his main collaborators. My father would never have seen them before they were exhibited. They would be exhibited, and then, you know, he would say to my mother, we have to bring these back. And they would go, how the hell are we going to do that? And I was at school, so I was around 12 or so when these arrived. One more thing about memory. I used to, listen to pop music, and it was a very exciting moment in Scotland in the early 1980s. I talked earlier about Orange Juice, Aztec Camera. I remember having a copy of the NME, the fashionable left-wing kind of pop newspaper of that time, with a photo of a band called Test Department, who were a bit like German noise, like Einstrasse and Neubauten, photographed standing on this sculpture in London from the bridge above. And that was quite strange for me to have those two worlds come together, because I was a country kid. I lived on a farm which had just become this garden gradually. So the stones arrived and were taken by a tractor up on a track and then left here. And they're left in this setting, which is a heathery plateau. It's the wild part of the garden. It's not lawn, it's not grass, it's not sculpture park. And I think that's quite important. It's Stonopathian. So in my father's very acute, almost catastrophized sensitivity to nature, the disorder and the order are partly his acute sensitivity to wildness and the moorland. He was agoraphobic. He never left Stony Path for 30 years. Wow. So that's partly why it was a country and a world. So his feeling was for the classical. That made him feel like he belonged. So he made a classical garden in a wilderness setting, like in the hills. It's quite an unusual quixotic gesture, and it depended on my mother. She was the gardener, really. So for me, Stony Path, Little Sparta, Ian and Sue, Mum and Dad, there's that dynamic. So within this, the tension of order and disorder is partly nature, culture. And we could talk about these, he's always creating these dichotomies, terror, virtue. I can talk in a minute about some other aspects of this fragility. It's the first epic work that he was able to make in the garden. The earlier pieces are of a smaller scale because of money, possibility. It's unusual in that, this is another thing to say, it doesn't really have a style. These are fragments of raw material of rock. You don't look at it and go, this is like a Greek temple, this is like a French Revolutionary style. It doesn't really have a style. It's minimal sculpture. It's minimalism meets Saint-Just. Very rare for me to have better pronunciation of French than other people, but Saint-Just
I did pretty well.
is the French Revolutionary that the quotation comes from. And Al, you talked about this, or one of you, I think it was that, this quality of, maybe you, about the quality of these separate words that feel like they could be shifted around and yet paradoxically are so heavy that they can't be moved by a human being. I'm going to give you one last things. I remember walking on these as an unhappy teenager in the dark, hearing some titanic row happening in the house, the chair being smashed, and being aware that as I walked, I was recombining the words. People now would probably not feel a reverence for the work that they wouldn't walk in it, but for me it was just something to walk around.
You were entitled, I think, if anybody was. You have just given us a new sense of disorder as the worried, alienated, maybe alienated from the marriage that produced you, teenager, overhearing and then walking on the order and disorder. This leads me to ask you a question, but I want to warn my friends that after I ask the question and Alec responds, I'm going to ask you each to try to, we never paraphrase, but to try to explain almost denotatively what the line means, because I don't think it should go without our attempt, because it means so many things. But here's the question first, Alec, and it follows from what you just said. We've had, happily I say, in the last dozen years, hundreds of conversations with poets and artists about works. Sometimes it's the work of someone else, long dead, not related, just somebody who wrote a poem that speaks to that person and we talk about it. In some cases, not as often as I would like, we're talking about the poem written by the person that we've come to meet. I don't think I've ever felt that we've had a situation here where the proximity, emotionally, autobiographically, and aesthetically, since you work in this environment of the kind of artistry that your father sought so closely. So in so many ways, this is an intimate conversation that's supposed to be an interpretation of a poem. Wow, I didn't ask a question, but I guess it gives the word, it's almost an understatement to talk about the autobiographical quality of this conversation.
I'm the last person to ask about the work, in a way, and also I'm a witness of the work.
You're a witness, exactly.
And I've always lived with that, and we all have a mother and a father of some kind. So that's just an inevitability of life, and I accept that. I used to do a lot more. I mean, I've edited my father's work. I went through a period of my life doing that, and now I have my own life. And the garden, the family has nothing to do with it. So we don't claim a kind of blood line or authorship. I don't give you the perfect account of the work, but I can tell you the memory of its arrival, and perhaps with a work that's so kind of austere and epic, it's quite interesting to bring the domestic
Yes.
into that. But I'm not here to bring.
Right.
I'm very comfortable just to talk with you, just to talk about that, because you will all have your own responses.
Lovely. Thank you for. Yes, thank you for that. No expectation in the asker of the question that there would be any kind of secretly definitive thing one would want to say about the autobiographical nature of it, but in fact, almost the opposite. Okay, gang, you really want to do this? Are we okay doing this? Okay, each of the four of us is going to essentially summarize, paraphrase, explain, restate the line. Sophia, you're looking at me.
Well, apparently I don't know what the last two words are.
Well, you can,
Riff.
yeah.
That's fine. But can I know what they are?
You're
The revolutionary French person who said this line. That's his name.
Quote.
Oh.
Sorry, we should have.
didn't even know
No, we should have said
Do you want
that.
me
It's
to do
okay.
a little riff on that
Saint-Just?
part of it?
Yeah, please.
So, the other interesting thing about this work, it almost comes at a fulcrum point in my father's career. I talked earlier about his dichotomies, these divisions, the sense of terror and virtue. And he's known for making toys, very pastel work, this very beautiful garden. But he also had a love of militaria and war and conflict, and in this case, revolution. And Saint-Just is the most terrifying of the Jacobin revolutionaries. John Berger compares him, when he writes about Che Guevara, he compares him to Saint-Just. He's the most austere, ice-cold leader, philosopher of the terror. He's Robespierre's right-hand man. He dies very young. And my father came into this adoration of the French Revolution around this period of late 70s, early 1980s. Out of his disputatiousness with the world, he'd had a legal case about this building he'd made that was a gallery that he then called a temple, and he didn't want to pay taxes on it. So he was in exile from the values of his time, and he found in the French Revolution a language, metaphors, a philosophy, rather than the poets of the Zukowskis or who of the Oppens who went to Marx, Lenin. My father was drawn back to the French Revolution, and the epic nature of these stones is his feeling for the revolution. And he told me a nice story once. My father quarrelled with almost everyone. He was that kind of man, and he'd quarrelled with Hugh McDermott.
Which wasn't so hard to do, I hear.
Which, no, they were like each other. McDermott was actually my father's best man at his first wedding. So they had been close when my father was young. So when my father became a proper poet, that created a rift. But just before McDermott died, my father wrote to him to make peace. And he said to him, "You were right about one thing, the epic." McDermott, for many people, had failed when he stopped writing beautiful short lyrics in Scots and wrote these epic Marxist poems. And my father was drawn to the epic of the revolution and to its tragedy. So the work is epic and I would say Heraclitean in its form, these fragments. There's a sense of ruin, but it's very much choosing the representative of terror as being the person who he wants to quote from. So it is a confrontation of our culture with what revolution actually is, and we are speaking in a moment of war, of massacre, so that hasn't gone away. And my father's nature was to take taboo and confront people with it, which led to tragedy for him in a way, but that was his need. So Saint-Just is who we have here. It's a fragment. It's a found poem.
Thank you. I'm so glad, Sophia, that you asked, because that was really important context for us all. So now that actually perfectly sets up as a kind of head note to what people do when they read the words. Leanne Browne, do you want to try to summarize, paraphrase?
Well, I see the is as an equal sign. So present order equals the disorder of the future, meaning there's where we used it, negentropic or entropic. Entropy is happening. Things are falling into disorder without justice. I see San Just. Without justice. That's what I feel.
Sans
Yeah.
just.
It's not just that this happens,
Yes.
but it's happening.
Without just.
There's a devolution happening without justice.
That's a pretty good reading. I like that. Laynie, can you top that?
No, but I can add another layer.
Okay.
Present order is this disorder of the future. A very simplistic way to think about it is what you sow, you will reap. So whatever structures we are now setting up, they are imperfect at best, and there will be repercussions. No matter what our intentions, they're not going to be perfect. They're going to be deeply flawed. And whenever we come to this piece, it is the present in which we come to the piece.
Yeah.
So right now, it's very resonant with all of the structures and institutions that we are trying to have new consciousness about, disassemble.
Interesting reading of the present. I appreciate that. There are two presents. There's the present of the person, the revolutionary who made the statement. That would be, the 1790s. There's the present of Finlay arranging for this to be installed. That present, when Alec was, 12 or 14. And then there's the present of our encountering it. So that's encountering this. So there's three
There's
presents.
also the present of the work itself has a form that is not of 1980. So there's the present of the distant past.
Right, it's
Oh,
like
yes.
It's
the
carved in
all-time.
classical style,
That's right.
but it has a
That's
quality. Maybe this is a funny thing to say, but if you saw it on a Greek island, it might not be completely surprising
Right.
as a kind of strange fragment of the Odyssey. So it has my father had a very strange relationship to time. He felt very like Pound,
Partly because he was
very
away from everybody
very
for so long.
contiguous with history.
Right.
So it's a kind of Canto's feeling for I am in the Renaissance at the same time as I am in ancient China.
Which is another definition of
it's a
epic,
slippage.
too.
And
Yes, exactly.
collapsing of time.
Yeah.
So it's
So-
all happening now. It's not linear or sequential.
So there almost is, there's a massive stability in the stone, but a massive instability in what the present is.
And there's always Sophia, I'm going to turn to you next, I promise. There's always this massive instability. I love that phrase for this. The minute anyone finishes, quote unquote, a work of art, especially one that took a lot to get to the finishing, in quotes, the finishing, it is always immediately battling with its presentness once it's done. Sophia, do you want to try this?
I'm thinking about disorder in the sense of affliction. You mentioned your father was agoraphobic. And so I'm thinking about...
It's another,
yeah.
we use the word disorder to refer to a diagnosis.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about... easy isn't the word I want, but I can't think of a better word. How easy, how natural it can be to leave heavy things behind. And so now I'm just thinking about generational trauma kind of resonance with this.
Wow. I'm going to go there. Forgive me. I'm going to do... So when I was in college, The idea was not simply to read Marx, which my immediate generational predecessors had done, but to read Marx and Freud together as a kind of novice way of dealing with two kinds of radicalism, the latter being extremely complicated as a radicalism. Well, they're both. So I have a double reading of this, forgive me. One is the thing that I think, the reading that most people give it, which is the Ozymandias thing of, you've come upon this thing that someone made and thought was going to be always grand and always powerful, but now look around you at the fucking world that this thing is in, and it's only an irony. Ha ha, ha ha. And the second reading dovetails, which is a psychoanalytic reading of the Marxian moment that's being quoted or recorded. And that is about the family, because every production of a new generation, in the Freudian sense, is going to lead to the worst disorder that the elder who created the present is going to perceive as disorder. And in the Freudian scenario, the child, or the son, not to put too fine a point on it, the son needs to do a Saint-Just-like rebellion in the familial setting in order to make sure that the person who thought that the present order was right and the disorder of the future, the next generation, was wrong, is going to have to see that there's disorder in the production of that next generation.
Well,
that's an over-reading, but I had to put it in there.
I have to come back on that one.
I hope you will, because I almost am sorry. It's just so
sorry. The
dramatic.
The revolution in that dynamic is gentleness. Not
well. Sometimes in Freud, it's not very gentle.
If the father identifies with the young French revolutionary hero, young, identifies him with Apollo, with force, with terror, then the son, whoever that son is, will actually react to that by being interested in healing and gentleness. To come back to the
So the Oedipal thing gets, it's reverse of what Freud usually thought was the situation.
I want to pick up what you're talking about the generational struggle, because I have had some thoughts about that. But let me do a little line here. So this disorder, the lovely reading of that. My father's agoraphobia came on in the 1950s, and he did therapy, and then he refused it very explicitly, and he writes a poem of refusal to his therapist and says, I am now just going to choose the beautiful. And he meets my mother, and he has the chance as an agoraphobic to make a world, a beautiful, safe retreat, a place full of, in effect, kind of toys. We would make toy boats, sail them, a loch, and a world. I'm going to make a little parallel here. Susan Howe, agoraphobic, Emily Dickinson, my father, Saint-Just. My father had a tragedy in him, which is in making this gentle place. At some point, something rebelled in him about the rest of the world not being poetic, beautiful,
gentle.
Yeah, I mean, he was never really gentle, but so he began to militarize the garden. He began to bring an Edenic fall into it, and bring first imagery of war, and then later of the revolution. So he brings in his own. But one present we didn't talk about, that I touched on earlier, is the ecological present. And I mentioned earlier that one of the interesting things about this particular spot is that it is still genuinely moorland. So it's the original fabric of that landscape, pre-garden. There are harebells and bog cotton, a flora that is not of the garden, but is of the hillside. The two works that I would bring into this conversation are very simple pieces. One is one of the earliest one-word poems he made as a sculpture in the garden on a kind of large stone, like a boulder, which just says, curfew, curlew. We've heard the bird song today. The poet feels the shift of one letter. And in that one letter we go from the curlew, which calls it evening. It's a very beautiful moorland bird, which signifies the pastoral, but my father hears it as a curfew. So in that moment already in 1967 or whenever he wrote that, there is a sense of threat within the pastoral. The other work is a single stone at Stony Path at Sparta, and it just says fragile. And it's placed quite near this piece at the far end of the garden. And when you look beyond it over the fence, you see the moor. And he's saying the garden is a fragile order. It has to be kept, maintained. In effect, it's remade every spring. When in winter at Stony Path, it's wild and the garden is gone. It's under snow. It loses its intimacy. So the fragility of the moorland garden is part of the present, the order, disorder. But within my father, I think that was his sensitivity. When I see him go into the revolution, what I see is the oversensitive poet hearing the curlew as a curfew and needing to say, there is violence in the world and we all need to face that. And I'm going to make you face that. And I am enraged that I am not of this world. So, and what I want to bring into the generational thing
Yes, I knew you were getting back to that.
is, compared to when I grew up, the young generation of poets now have an enormous move towards social justice and an enormous move towards bullying and condemning and accusation. And they live in a very reverent culture, and there's a lot of fear in that culture. My father lived a number of really horrifying disputes because he made work that was so controversial. And that was visited then back on him. Someone talked about the seeds. And that really kind of destroyed the family in some ways. It was very difficult. He had disputes around being a fascism, anti-Semitism, because he created this work that was taboo. And he knew that, but and what I see in him is a kind of precursor to what social media did to culture, where it enabled wonderful movements of social justice in terms of commonality. We learned to understand oppression better and lack of justice. But at an individual level, it also led to an enormous level of fear, intimidation, fantasy, narcissism, violence, which I grew up with pre-social media. And I think that that's where this Oedipal thing for me exists. Right. That in my generation of poets in Scotland, we see every now and then these condemnations of people, and we're bystanders. And we don't quite understand what's happening, because we used to have disputes about aesthetics and whether you use Scots or English or whether you were progressive or not in a particular way. And they were very personal, but people couldn't quite intimidate one another in the same way. And what I see happening now is a different level of the personal public being confused. And that's what I remember growing up with, was being a school kid whose father would be having a dispute with the French government. And that was very strange, that you were feeling a sense of history actually coming into your bedroom, that you couldn't quite understand how this work, like this kind of piece, would travel to France or wherever and create this kind of catastrophic debate. The French didn't want to celebrate. It was the bicentenary of the revolution just after this work in '89, and my father was the poet, artist who created like 4 different exhibitions, and that became part of a kind of conflagration. Like we see now with our own conflagrations of how do we deal with Israel and Palestine? How can we have a conversation about that? How do we deal with the terror that comes into our lives, our homes? So that's where I see the Oedipal in that, is there is always the dispute between generations.
Right.
But to me it has somehow become more bloody because we no longer know how to contain the energy of that dynamic.
So, more disorder, underscored, italicized, disorder increases, can increase.
It's that's my personal
Yeah.
sense of it.
Okay, well, final thoughts. I mean, there's so much we've said. It's been a remarkable conversation about this work. Leanne,
Well,
do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, the main thing I'm thinking about is just what you were saying about the wild moor plants and how they are present and how that disorder is going to be the future of the garden someday. That it'll come back. That's what I see there. That'll be taken over. That no longer be maintained. It'll be gone. There might be some stones visible for a few decades, but so that I feel that projection. You know.
And before that happens, the catastrophe in the ecology may even mean that some of the plants don't
Right.
grow there. So
Yeah, we don't know what that disorder will be.
the future is no longer singular to that garden. We now live in a time when rather than going, how do we preserve this amazing place or this amazing place, it's the whole garden of our world.
Laynie?
So if the stony path is an invented country, then the future is also always an invention that we have to continually make. And this piece just reminds me of that tension of the assembling and the disassembling that is constant. And you mentioned the wilderness as a classroom, and that seems really instructive to thinking about the piece.
Lovely. Thank you. Sophia?
I mean, I'm just kind of blown away by everything you said. I don't know if I have much to add, except for you mentioned all these toys in your home, and I just like that it says present, because when I think of present, I think of a wrapped toy.
Well,
Another sense of present.
the best toys in my house belong to my father. And I remember in my bedroom, he would make model boats as a therapy, and he loved them, and little fishing boats, and they would live in my bedroom on a stand. And it was always unclear. They were grown-ups' toys.
My
And
stepdad
then-
did the same thing.
And
They're
then
his toys.
later on, they moved to another room, and a bust of Saint-Just appeared in my bedroom. And I kind of was like, really? Really? No.
Not subtle there. Oh, Alec.
No, just because there was no room.
Oh, yeah, sure.
No, really, it was that.
This was
but,
after the therapy was done? Or?
but it's a very interesting thing to grow up. I mean, Dickinson is in that in my mind.
Yeah.
Remarkable people who grow up in an ordinary setting, an ordinary place with a preternatural sensitivity to it and give us a gift. You know, I think of Dickinson's, I never know how to pronounce it, but all the fragments that Susan writes about and recovers, kind of like a garden. They're the
Seeds.
ecology of Dickinson,
Yeah.
which we all attune to.
Yeah.
So my father had a genius, like a Dickinsonian genius, and there's a sensitivity in that. But sometimes in some people, that exile is so painful to them. There is also fury. And we know that in poets there is an unnatural level sometimes of sensitivity and sometimes of fury. And what we have to think about is how we use our conversation. That's what you are to me when I listen to you. You show that conversation is still possible. We can talk about a poet that we don't like, that we disagree with, that we think behave badly, and we can love their work. We can also enjoy our different interpretations. The variety of the ecology of the conversation is the gentleness. And that, to me, is where we can take the order in one hand and the disorder in the other and go, no, actually these can speak to each other. The moorland and the garden don't have to be seen as a tragic conflict. You know, that we can make another garden.
It's the opposite of Dickinson's spreading wide.
Yeah, I don't believe in those dichotomies. For me, that's what poetry is actually about, getting beyond.
That feels so like a wonderful final word, and I'm regretting the fact that I'm now going to add my final word. Actually, two different points. There is no final. Two final words, two final things to say. One is, what you just said makes me think that Wallace Stevens' anecdote of the jar, which was a kind of a revolutionary modernist thing, is ultimately wrong from this point of view, which is, it wasn't the slovenly wilderness that got tamed by the colonialism of the jar, the modern form, Picasso-like form that gets placed there. That war that's gently implied by this clever little poem, the war between form and what is unformed, which is really offensive if you really push it all the way to Stevens visiting Tennessee on a business trip, probably using a wide-mouthed jar as moonshine, a vessel for moonshine, and then probably drunken one night, put it down in the middle of the Tennessee wilderness where he got the moonshine, I'm making this up, and then realized that he had conquered the whole thing with his modernist imagination. And I think that your father is saying something very different about the relationship, as agonistic as it is sometimes. But my second thought is either relevant or partly irrelevant.
The options.
Those are the options. No, the third option is completely irrelevant. I spend a lot of time teaching and rewatching video testimonies of Holocaust survivors. And the one that I admire the most is of a man named Menachem. And Menachem was a child during the war in Krakow. And he was sent on his own by his parents, who figured that was a way for him to be saved. And so he grew up not understanding anything that was happening to him. And when his parents came out of the ghetto, they survived Plazhov. They survived it. He refused to recognize them or didn't recognize them and wouldn't call them by any other name than Mr. and Mrs. And it was very difficult. Then when he was a father, he became an obstetrician. He had the pride of delivering his own children. This was very important to him. As a child survivor, he wanted to be the one to birth the children. And in any case, when his daughter, first child, was about to come home, he was preparing the house for the child to come home. And when his wife got there, the room had been set up with toys that were for 5 and 6 year olds, a pedal car, and a rocker, and all this games that, you had to be 10 years old to play. And his wife said, Menachem, with all due respect, what are you doing? Why did you buy? And he said, a child needs toys. A child needs toys. He kept insisting. And then he says to us, looking at the camera, it took me a long time to understand that those toys were for me. Thank you, all of you. Alec, this is, I can't even describe the journey this has been in talking about this work of your father's.
I think I didn't say that. It's really simple. What I find fascinating about that work, going back to it, is that it belongs. I think that was my father's genius. You wouldn't really think that these massive stones would belong. You would think it would seem eccentric.
Right.
And that's underneath the struggles of his life, his ability to create a sense of belonging for, the poem. And I think you're hard on Stevens, and I don't even, not particularly a fan, but what he left is the poem.
He certainly did. Not the jar, but the poem about the jar.
And the jar is what we are talking. The poem is what
Yeah.
allows us to.
Yeah, I do think that the belonging might be the one word to describe what Menachem was seeking.
And for me, it was what I was talking about at Billy a Crew, was really that one could belong with a new technology, which is an unusual thing. Technology often feels foreign to us at first,
There is
but
an
there was a
intimacy.
belonging there,
Yeah.
and I think that's been a undercurrent in the whole
Yes,
conversation.
and it's been a great conversation. Browne, Laynie Browne, Sophia DuRose, and Alec Finlay, thank you so much.